Hello and welcome. I'm Maria from Sew Through Time, and this time we're talking about nalbinding, the oldest documented technique of using yarn to make fabric and making a pair of Viking-age socks. Nalbinding has been around for at least 10,000 years. The oldest examples found in the Middle East. It uses a single needle typically made of bone, horn, or wood, shaped much like a modern darning needle. You work with short lengths of yarn at a time, typically about 1 to 2 yards long, and form knots that create the fabric. The technique has been used at least throughout Europe, Middle East, China, North and South Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific Islands. Originally, nalbinding was mainly used to create socks, hats, mittens, along with different types of bags and pouches. Wool, due to its ability to felt, is by far the easiest fiber to use. When you reach the end of your working yarn, you just wet felt the next length of yarn onto the previous end. By the Middle Ages, null-bound socks were largely replaced by cloth hose, but especially mittens continued to be widely used to the 17th and 18th century, while in the Nordic countries it continued to be common well into the 20th century. There are many different stitches that can be used that are often named after the place the example is first found from. The fabric they produce tends to be quite flat, some of them firm with very little give, others have much more give to them. All in all, nalbinding fabric tends to resemble more crochet as far as qualities go rather than knitting, though there are examples of stitches that resemble stockinette very closely. And because of the knotted nature of the fabric, it doesn't unravel, unlike knitting or crochet, so it produces a far more durable fabric that can easily endlessly be repaired, since all you need to do is fill in the hole with new knots. Now, as far as what types of socks they had, most of the existing evidence is of very short ankle socks or slipper type of socks. But since in general there are very little garments that survive from 1,000 years ago, especially in the north due to soil conditions, we don't know whether this is because those were just the most common ones or because there's survivor bias. But there is at least one grave find where there are wool fibers underneath the clothing next to the skin at shin length, pointing to the presence of longer, possibly knee-high socks. And since I have poor circulation at my extremities, that's what I chose to do. I'm using the Oslo stitch because that one makes the most sense to me and was fairly easy to learn. These make extremely comfortable and well-fitting cozy socks. I would recommend first doing a small practice sampler, first to get the hang of the stitch and work out the tension so that when you get to the actual fabric, it doesn't have huge holes in it. I'm fairly inexperienced when it comes to nalbinding, this being only the second project ever. But I'm very used to knitting and sewing, so it took me several times of getting knotted messes and a couple of rounds of practice piece to figure out the tension and really see where the loops are that I need to be working with. So be prepared for a bit of a learning curve and some initial frustration with it.
Start by threading the needle with the initial piece of yarn that you're working with, and then get a little bit of a tail and then twirl it around 2 fingers to form 2 loops. Position these loops so that the working yarn is towards you and the tail end is away from your body. Now work your needle through it, forming a figure 8 on the needle. And making sure that the working yarn faces towards you, pull your needle through the loops. Make sure that the working yarn goes over your thumb when this happens so that it forms a loop on your thumb. This is very important because this is the base of the whole stitches that we do. And again, make sure that that working yarn goes over your thumb towards you. And then find that loop that we just worked into and then push your needle through that, the working loop on your thumb and the working yarn. And then that forms a new loop onto your thumb. And again, we find that previous thumb loop and the current thumb loop and the working yarn, and the needle goes through all of them. And then you drop the thumb loop behind you and form a new thumb loop. And again, through the thumb loop old thumb loop through the new thumb loop and through the working yarn. This is your basic stitch that forms the chain that all work begins with. If this is your first time trying nalbinding, you might want to do a few of these chains to really get a hang of the stitch and understand what is going on before you move forward into the actual work. For your actual work, you want to make 12 stitches initially. Once you have the 12 stitches, drop your working needle and grab a darning needle. For now, we're going to leave that working end of the yarn untouched and work with the tail end instead. Thread that tail end onto the darning needle. Now put the darning needle through the second to last thumb loop, the one you would have been working with normally. And make sure that your work is even so that it isn't twirled around like mine is here. Here you can see kind of where the knots look flatter. That's the working side. And now starting with that second to last thumb loop, we place all of those previous thumb loops onto the darning needle. This way you have that last thumb loop that you can again replace on your thumb and continue your work, but the rest of these thumb loops will form a tight circle once that tail end yarn is pulled all the way through, much like in a magic loop in knitting. And once that circle is pulled tightly, we take off the darning needle and replace it again with the working end of the yarn and the nalbinding needle. And now find that last thumb loop from your work. It should be sticking out separate from the others, much larger than the others. Now instead of working through the loop right directly behind you, you start by taking 2 loops on the previous work. Initially this is a little difficult, but just try to find 2 loops that are nearby and get them onto the needle. And then pick up that loop that is directly behind your thumb loop and that thumb loop onto your needle, and make sure that your working yarn is also over your thumb, and going underneath the needle, the needle going underneath it, so that it forms the new thumb loop. Now it will start to become more clear what the previous stitches are, and we grab again 1 and 2 loops from the previous stitches and the previous thumb loop that is directly behind your current thumb loop, and then make sure that that working yarn stays over so that it goes over to your thumb. And then to increase, we want to work into those same loops we just worked into to create the next stitch into that same stitch, so that the beginning of the work doesn't become too small. And now, because we're running out of working yarn, we grab the skein of wool and grab again a yard or 2 yards of wool, depending on how you're comfortable with working. And then you can either use scissors to cut this, or traditionally this is usually just split with hands. Because this yarn is too thick to be split just by pulling, I grab it by the strands and pull them so that they will split. Some will say you have to split them by hand to get a nice even connection, but honestly, I don't see a difference. Do whatever is comfortable for you. Grab the working yarn and the new yarn and place them so that they are in your hand about several inches on top of each other. And now wet your hand. You can either use spit, that's what is used traditionally, but if that seems icky to you, you can just use water. And then just rub them between your hands, and the heat and the friction will felt it together with the moisture. Sometimes you'll need to re-wet your hand to really get all of the ends properly felted together. But you'll be able to tell when they're felted together because you won't see a clear line between the 2 threads, and when you gently pull on them, they will not separate. And then we can continue working as before. On these initial rounds that will form the toe, you want to work into every other loop twice to increase, to give room for your toes. Try on the work onto your foot as you go, and then you'll notice when you have increased enough for your foot size, and then you can continue working only once into every loop. Continue trying it on as you work along the foot, because some people's feet widen more than others. Some people might need to increase after the initial toe increases. Others might not. And once the sock has reached the top of your foot, it becomes time to leave the empty space where we will later put the heel in. And the way we leave that empty space for the heel is by working in that chain stitch again. So we don't use any of the loops on the work, but grab just the loop from behind and the thumb loop, and then work under the working yarn to form a new thumb loop. The number of chain stitches you work is half of the number of stitches you have on the sock currently. So since I have 38 stitches all in all, I work 19 chain stitches. But this will vary depending on your yarn thickness and also how wide your feet are. I have very narrow feet, so I don't have a lot of stitches. Once you've worked those 19 stitches, you count 19 stitches on your work from the last stitch you took on the work and put your needle through that last 19th loop. And from here on out, you'll continue in the 3-loop method. That first stitch taking 2 loops from the working work, and then 1 from behind your chain stitch, and then again the thumb loop, and then the working yarn again. And you will continue this way, working up your leg, leaving that hole for your heel. If you're wanting to make a short sock, continue only for a few more rows of this, and then you can finish off the sock. If, on the other hand, you're continuing to make a long sock, remember to check it on your leg all the time to make sure that you start increasing for the calf at the necessary spot. I made all my increases at the back of the leg, but I didn't really necessarily make sure that they were all aligned, because it doesn't really matter as long as it's in the approximate same place, so that it gives the proper shape to the calf. Just keep stitching till you've reached the desired length, and once you do reach that length, you just slip your thumb out of that working loop and pull tight. This will secure the work since it's all knots anyways, so you don't necessarily need to secure it in any other way. Then you can just weave in the end for a nice even finish. Then we flip the foot portion inside out and weave in the end from the toe. And now it's time to work on the heel. We start by doing the same beginning loop as if we were just starting a new piece of work. After doing the initial beginning loop, then we do 1 chain stitch into that loop, and then we work into the actual work. You pick up 2 loops from the side of your heel and then work it as if you would normally doing the Oslo stitch. And you continue 1 round working into every stitch. Once you reach the end of this round, you will encounter the weird clump at the beginning, and then you just ignore the very first part of it and leave that clump on the inside and work normally into the first stitch on it. When you come back to the weave in the ends, it will get sorted out, so don't worry about it at this point. And the second round continues to be stitched normally into every single stitch. When we get to the beginning of the 3rd row, instead of picking up that first stitch like you would normally, here we go 1 stitch beyond that so that there's an empty spot in between. And you'd pick up both loops from that stitch, and then you pick up the back loop normally and do the normal stitch. And you skip a loop like this for the next 3 times, decreasing 3 stitches. Then you continue stitching normally into every stitch until you reach the other side of the heel, where you also decrease the 3 stitches by moving past 3 of the loops. So you want to start the decreases when you still have 6 loops left on that edge of the heel. It might sound a little confusing here, but there is clearly a side to the heel when you look at the stitching as you work, and you can clearly see it here. And once you turn the work, you do another 3 decreases, again on that side, so that there's on both corners 6 decreases altogether. And then you work a second row of these 12 decreases in 1 row. And then for the final row, you skip a stitch each time. And you continue working like this until there's only a tiny hole in the middle left. And And then to close that final hole, you take your stitches normally onto your needle, but you take your thumb out of the work and pick up all those previous thumb stitches onto your needle as if you are forming that same kind of loop as in the beginning when we worked with the non-working yarn to close that toe hole. This can be a little tricky and you can't necessarily always see exactly what you're doing, so I recommend sometimes working your needle through part of the stitches to make it a little bit easier for it to bend around the circle. Just take your time with it and work slowly, and don't worry if you don't catch every single of those stitches because like I said, these are knotted anyways, so it's not going to unravel. It's just going to be neater looking if you can get all the ends. And lastly, poke your needle through to the wrong side and there weave in that very last end. And now congratulations, you're done with your first sock. Now to repeat that whole thing again to make the second one, and then you have a pair of nice Viking-age socks. These socks are typically held up by using tablet woven garters that are tied below the knee, and they do hold up the sock quite well. In my experience, you want to tie them on the outside of your leg so that your legs don't rub against them and open them while you're walking. But as a modern replacement, you can use a strip of elastic instead. And here is the full ensemble with my Viking era dress. Because I used a worsted weight yarn, they do take up quite a bit of room in my shoes, so that's a thing to consider when you're choosing the yarn. Well, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please hit that like button because it really does help out in this world. And if you haven't watched the making of this Viking dress that I'm wearing, go ahead and watch that too. And if you haven't already, I hope you've subscribed so that I can see you again next time. Bye!